Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Nice to see everybody. Friends, I'm John Cavadini. I'm director of the Institute for Church Life. And I'm so pleased to be able to welcome you this morning to the first lecture in our fall series for this season called Saturdays with the Saints. Friends, who are the saints? The saints are those who stretch our imagination. They interpret the mystery of the faith with the medium of their lives. They emerge from the life of the church, and they do belong to the church, but they don't belong to the church alone. The saints are for all people. How could it be otherwise, since the Lord, whose image they bear, was the compassion and strength of God made incarnate for all men and women. The saints, by their witness to his love and compassion, allow us to see the whole world anew. They're like lights in the world, reflecting the light of Christ, meant to help us imagine our own way into the hope and love to which they have borne such beautiful witness. Blessed be the most holy Trinity. Blessed be God and his angel and his saints. Friends, there's lots of room. Don't be shy. Friends, before I introduce our speaker, I see today we have two members of our own Institute for Church Life Advisory Council here. So I'd like to recognize them, Ron and Kathy Tisch, who are welcome. Friends, there's lots of room, so.
Sure.
You know, if you think about the title, Saturdays with the Saints, Saturday is the ancient Sabbath, and we know that in Jewish and Christian tradition, Sabbath is an image of eternal life. So in a very real way, we will be spending Saturdays with the Saints, eternally, hopefully. And so not many lecture series can claim to be an image of eternity. But this one can. So it is my pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker for today. Larry Cunningham is the John A. O'Brien Chair of Catholic Theology Emeritus here at the University of Notre Dame. Professor Cunningham was the very first speaker in this whole lecture series when we started it 5 years ago. And it's a pleasure then to be able to welcome him back to inaugurate this, our 5th season. Since 2010, Larry has retired from active duty as a faculty member on campus, but you really wouldn't know it. He's still one of the best known and most beloved figures on campus, which is an exact quote from my introduction from 2010. He's still contributing to our classes, especially in our PhD program here in the Department of Theology. And of course, his scholarship still continues unabated in the areas of Catholicism, its culture and thought, spirituality and mysticism, prayer, and of course, the saints. Most recently, and very germane to our program today, is his beautiful book, The Chapels of Notre Dame. This is not the book itself, but here's an image of its cover. This was published in 2013 by University of Notre Dame Press and was named an outstanding book for 2013 by the University Press Book Association, which is a subset of the American Library Association. We're sure to be the beneficiaries of the same inspiration that created this book as we listen to today's presentation entitled Mary at Notre Dame. So please join me in welcoming Professor Cunningham.
I'd like to begin by reading you a letter that Father Soren wrote just on the eve of his 70th birthday. He wrote it to the little students, the grammar school students who attended Notre Dame at that time. They were known as the minims, the minimal ones. And they lived in St. Edward's Hall. And so Father Soren wrote this. It was, of course, snowing. So it's always snowing at Notre Dame. Were I a poet, I would draw some inspiration from this beautiful snow just now storming from all sides over the dome and playing all sorts of antics around its crowning monument, our Blessed Mother's golden statue. How delightfully this first snow reminds me of our first departure from France. It was on the feast of Our Lady of the Snows, August the 5th, 1841. I never believed in chance, but on this occasion I understood at once and realized that the Blessed Virgin herself, for whom we were actually and joyfully sacrificing all, little as it was, had accepted the modest homage of our honest hearts and had herself this beautiful feast for the day of our adoption among her own missionaries, and wished to assure us from the start that she would be our star of the sea and guide and protectress through the snows of the northwest of the New World. To me, it was a revelation. I accepted it in full confidence, and now, after an experience of 42 years, I confess with an unspeakable sense of gratitude that our fondest hopes have been from day to day realized beyond all expression. First of all, that's beautifully written, as only someone in the 19th century could write something beautifully in the days before email. But secondly, I think that what's even more interesting about it is that it is saturated with the imagery of Our Lady, which should not come as a big surprise because Father Edward Soren was a Frenchman who was representative of the so-called French School of Spirituality and had a keen devotion to Our Lady. There are three images, actually, in this text. One is the image which is over the Golden Dome, on the campus of Notre Dame, over the main building. The second one is his remembrance that he departed France on August the 5th, which was the feast of Our Lady of the Snows. And that is an interesting feast day in its own right. Originally, it was a feast to commemorate the founding of the Basilica of St. Mary Major, Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, which houses, by the way, one of the oldest images of Our Lady found in Rome, the Salus Populi Romani, the Savior of the Roman people, which Pope John Paul II asked for a oil lamp to be lit in front of that image, which is now the case. The basilica was founded very early, probably, history's a little misty here, but probably as a tribute to the declaration of the Council of Ephesus in the early 5th century that Mary was indeed the Theotokos or Theotokos, the God-bearer, or in Latin, the Deipara, the one who bears God. Somewhere around the year 1000, there became attached to this basilica the story that its foundation place came because there was a unexpected snow that occurred on the 5th of August, and I can tell you that's rather unlikely in Rome. And this marked the spot where the so-called Liberian Peninsula, named for the family that donated the monies for the church, was erected. In the 16th century, the feast day became known as Our Lady of the Snows, but it is really the dedication day of this great, beautiful basilica. The other reference, of course, is to the fact that when Father Sorin left France, he was sailing, and so he invokes the star of the sea, that she, Mary, would be our star of the sea. The star of the sea is another phrase for the pole star, for the North Star, which was the mariner's star, the star that all mariners used. And Mary became known as the Star of the Sea, Stella Maris. That's a very old title for Our Lady. There is a hymn in Mary's honor, Ave Maris Stella, which dates all the way back to the 8th century. It has been sung in the liturgical offices of the church and in devotional settings from that time on to the present. But what Father Sorin had in mind was this statue of Our Lady that sits above the Golden Dome, recognizable from everywhere. I serve as a volunteer museum guide and guide at the Basilica a couple mornings a week in my retirement. Not too many people come into the museum, so I can get a lot of work done. I can read and take notes and whatnot. But I frequently run across people who actually spotted the Golden Dome from the toll road or something and just whipped off the toll road or they heard about Notre Dame, to come in and visit the Basilica. So this figure of Our Lady with the lightning rod above her head sits at the top of the Basilica. It was modeled after this figure. Those of you who know the city of Rome will know that one of the favorite tourist places, non-ecclesiastical tourist places in Rome, are the Spanish Steps that run from a square up to the Church of San Trinità dei Monti, Holy Trinity on the hilltop. And in 1857, to honor the declaration of the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, which was in 1854, they put a column in the middle of the Piazza di Spagna, the Spanish piazza, and put a statue of Our Lady on top of that. And every year on December the 8th, the Pope comes from the Vatican into the center part of the city and crowns the figure of Our Lady to celebrate the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. And you can actually see a floral crown draped over her arm. Actually, a Roman fireman puts it up there. You know, they bring a fire truck with a ladder. Pope Francis can do many things, but one thing he can't do is to climb up and crown that statue. And that's done every year. That figure of Our Lady, under the aegis of her Immaculate Conception, is a kind of a figure of Our Lady that you find multiplied many, many times. I don't have a slide of this, but there's the old miraculous medal of Our Lady. And the figure of that miraculous medal is very, very similar to this figure, usually Our Lady standing alone. The Romans have a tendency to overdo things, so they have that not very attractive crown of stars, but they have their own particular symbolism. So I read Father Sorin's letter, and here we have this great sense of Our Lady. This is the statue that you see in a niche at the very end of Sacred Heart Church, Sacred Heart Basilica, in the so-called Lady Chapel. It's over the Bernini altarpiece that sits up there. And I want to spend a moment or two thinking about this figure because it is one of the most frequently represented images of Our Lady, namely the figure of Our Lady who holds the Christ child. Oftentimes you will see that figure where Mary is seated. I'm going to show you some examples of that. And the Christ child is held directly in front of her. This particular one, which is very reminiscent of the kinds of things that you find in the Gothic churches of France, has Mary holding forth the Christ child. I would love to tell you that statue is a great artistic treasure. It isn't. It's a standard figure of Our Lady. But I find it very moving because of a custom that we have here at Notre Dame. Every Sunday evening during the school year, we have Vespers in the Basilica at 7:15. Those of you who are around here and haven't gone to them, you should go sometime. They only last about 30 minutes. They rotate the choirs, so they'll have the Schola or the liturgical choir or the women's choir. So the Vespers are sung Vespers, the same Vespers that were sung in the Roman basilicas in the early Middle Ages, specifically the Lateran basilicas, the cathedral Vespers. And at the end of Vespers, after the priest wishes everyone peace, he then says, "Let us turn to the figure of Our Lady, the patroness of this university." And the congregation, typically 100 people or so, will turn, they sit antiphonally in the Lady Chapel, and face this figure of Our Lady and sing the Salve Regina. Sometimes that hymn will change depending on the season, but most of the year the Salve Regina. Well, I think that's a wonderful, moving thing to do. It's in honor of Our Lady, and I'm a particular fan of the hymn Salve Regina, which is sung in every monastery and religious house at the end of Compline or the end of Vespers. Every monastery in the country, everyone facing the image of Our Lady. That hymn we think, was written by a monk, German monk, before the year 1000, who was called Hermanus Contractus, Herman the Cripple. He obviously had some kind of health problems or something, and he wrote that great hymn of Our Lady. And it's something to think about, the tradition of the church. That hymn has been sung for 1,000 years in the Catholic Church in honor of Our Lady. I one time met, I don't meet this very often, I one time met an extremely aggressive Protestant street preacher, convert maker. And he talked about, adoring Mary. And I was in a bad mood. Typically, I'm not in a bad mood, but I was in a bad mood this day. I said, "Look, bud, we were singing a hymn to Our Lady 500 years before Martin Luther was born, for 1,000 years. And it's not adoration, but it's serious business." Here, by the way, is one of the most famous pieces of French art. I showed you the Notre Dame statue, but this is the window known as the beautiful window, La Belle Verrière, from the Cathedral of Chartres. And here you see this is maybe 100 years after the time of Herman the Cripple. But this is the great figure of Our Lady holding forth the Christ child. This is the so-called seat of wisdom figure of Mary holding forth the Christ child. You can see examples of that. I'm going to show you a couple later on from the campus, and one in particular that may even be contemporary with this one. But that's a very old figure. You can, all over Romanesque art, you can find this figure of Our Lady, seat of wisdom, Our Lady holding the child in front of her. In the Eastern tradition, in the icon tradition, I have a couple icons to show you too. One of my favorites is the one where Mary holds the Christ child and points with her finger to the Christ child. And in Greek, that icon is known as hodoteria. Hodos meaning way, hodos. So this icon is known as she who points the way. There's a lot of deep theology in that, she who points the way. There's a variation, which I'm going to show you, of the all-merciful Madonna, which is another iconic theme. The cathedrals that were built around Paris in the 12th century, the so-called Ile-de-France, which are spectacular pieces of architecture, all have an extremely strong Marian emphasis to them. It's a miraculous thing to kind of think about, to study about. You have, beginning in the 11th, but especially in the 12th century, this great flourishing of Marian devotion, not only in France, but all over Europe. Some of you may know that Henry Adams wrote a book at the turn of the century called The Virgin and the Dynamo. And he says in the 12th century, it was the Virgin who energized the entire culture of Gothic France and its and adjacent countries, just as the dynamo or the engine has energized late 19th century industrial revolution. And he has a beautiful, if somewhat romantic view of this particular relationship. This is a work by the late Anthony Lauck, CSC. Does anyone know where that is? It's in the main foyer of De Bartolo. You know why a lot of people don't know that? Because everybody comes in the side entrances. You know, the main entrance, which faces towards the Morris Inn and whatnot, but if you walk in this, I think, really terrific piece of art, was done by Father Anthony Lauck, a Holy Cross priest whose art is found all over the campus. And he entitled it, Our Lady of the University. Our Lady of the University.
It was the circle, and then it was the bronze one was the circle.
Yeah, that's right. Of Father Lauck's work, there are numbers of multiplied examples. In fact, I'm going to show the Visitation, which is outside the bookstore, and there's a small version of that in the chapel of Walsh Hall, the chapel of the Visitation. This is a more contemporary work, and the title tells it all, Seat of Wisdom. This is an outdoor sculpture which is outside the chapel of Malloy Hall. And this was done also by Holy Cross priest, Father Flanagan. I don't know what Father Flanagan's first, Jim, I guess his first name is, but I always called him Flash. Flash Flanagan, but Father James Flanagan, this great figure. And I remember when this was in the process of being designed, we actually had a little committee meeting and had a big discussion about how he was, I had never thought about this because I'm not an artist, how he was to do this, because people would see it, but they wouldn't see it right at eye level. They would see it, the figure being a little higher than at eye level, but you wanted to create the illusion that it would be at high level. And this is another example of the seat of wisdom. This is one of my favorite pieces on the campus of the University of Notre Dame, and it's has quite a beautiful story, I think, attached to it. Got to watch my time so I don't overstay my welcome. This is a triptych. So triptych in the sense that these open up. And this does not give you a good sense of the size of it. It's not that big. It's about yay high, about maybe knee high or something. It's in O'Neill Hall, and it is enclosed in a glass case. I thought that Matt Cashore did a very good job of getting a photograph. It's a very hard thing to photograph. We don't know who the artist was. We don't know who the saints are here. One of the O'Neill family had it adjudicated by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They think it's 14th century. Not quite sure what country it comes from, but it's an absolutely beautiful piece of work. Probably a devotional triptych. Big ones, big triptychs, the ones that are very high, oftentimes are located in chapels. This could have been located in a private home. But what I think is particularly interesting about this, and I was struck by it when I was working on the chapels book, are all of these things. These are all notices of the death of high school students, classmates or college students that were classmates or friends of the men who live in O'Neill Hall. And as mementos, they have put these figures, sliding them inside the frame of the window. So I'm not going to do it, but I could go on at great and boring length about the deep history that's behind doing such things. I'm always distracted when I'm driving on highways when I see those little wayside shrines. Or if you remember back, those of you who are old enough to remember back to 9/11, how people automatically began to build mementos and shrines and put pictures and so on afterwards. That's a very, very deep sentiment. And I think that it's interesting that in O'Neill Hall, the students, I've never asked the rector, but I don't think the rector said, oh, put those things around there. I think that was a instinctive thing to do on the part of students. And it shows a kind of a deep devotional intention that is somewhat admirable. Now, Dillon Hall. Here's what I like about this. The candles. There's two halls I've discovered where they have places for students to light candles. I suppose it's not more widespread because probably the people that are interested in insurance on the campus of Notre Dame just wonder about whether or not you want to be having flames all over the place. But I was very touched when I saw this. This is an Eastern icon. Above, it's a contemporary version of what's called the Vladimir icon, one of the most treasured ancient icons in the Russian church, in the old church. Now, if you look at the original, it looks pretty much like this one. It hasn't changed much. There's something very traditional about icons. They don't want you innovating in icons. And I finally got an insight into how this operates. There was a great French Byzantinist, an art historian and Byzantinist named André Grabar. He's now dead 20 years. And some years ago, I read a book that he wrote. And in that book, he said, people claim that the Eastern tradition is extremely traditional in the sense that they don't change. There are minute changes. They don't change the style of art in the Eastern Church. So if you look at 20th century icons, they look very much like 17th century icons that look like 12th century icons. And Grabar said, that's a misunderstanding of how icons are understood in the East. He said, icons in the East are understood as having sacred value. Icons are displayed in the Eastern Church somewhat the way the Holy Eucharist is displayed in the Western Church. You don't have that custom in the Eastern Church that you do in the Western Church. And he says, and the idea is that once these icons are appreciated, they ought not to be changed. And here's the example that he gives, which I thought was a really big insight for me. He says, when Mozart writes a score, he said the interpreter of that score, the pianist or the orchestra, attempts to be as faithful to that score as possible. You don't change the score. So if you're playing a little Mozart piece, Eine kleine Nachtmusik, a little night music, you don't say, well, I think I'll make it a little afternoon music and jazz it up a little bit. You try to be as faithful as possible to the intention of the art and the genius of the artist who wrote the music in the first place. And he said the icon writer, they call themselves writers, not painters, the icon writer attempts to do the same thing. He wants to be as faithful to the image that he has before him as is possible. But I like the fact that in Dillon Hall they also have the candles. This practice, by the way, in the Western Church of the appearance of icons is a relatively new phenomenon in the church, widespread after the Second Vatican Council, almost unheard of in the Western Church, even in the 40s and the 50s. That's a safe generalization, even though there are exceptions to the rule. And there has been a rediscovery of the icon tradition in the Western Church. I noticed that in the local cathedral here in South Bend, that the pastor has a rotating icon in the front of the altar every day. Okay, moving on. This is another Anthony Lauk. This is the Visitation sculpture. This is right outside the bookstore. I was talking to someone from development. Every once in a while, for donors and whatnot, they give small versions of this to people who have been very generous to the university and whatnot. It depicts Mary going up into the hill country to greet Elizabeth. This is a particularly interesting sculpture to look at because with difficulty, because they have this ornamental grass around, this is a sculpture that you can actually walk around. And you can see it from various angles, which is a way monumental outdoor sculpture ought to be seen. You know, if you go to the Bargello Museum in Florence, there's a statue about as tall as I am of David by Donatello. And this is odd to think about this. This was the first statue cast in Western Europe to be seen by walking around since the end of the Roman Empire. Before that, everything was stuck up against walls. So, but Donatello's David, small when he's a young man, depicted as a young man. I think he's standing on the head of Goliath. it was for a garden, and you could see it from every angle. That was a kind of an innovation, but this is I often walk by going to the bookstore, and I sometimes like to look at it from various angles, which is the way the artist did it. This is in the Basilica. It's a rendition of Our Lady of Guadalupe. I've noticed working in the Basilica, a lot of people come back and want to pray in this chapel. If you walk in the Basilica, it's in the chapel on the left-hand side as you're going back towards the Lady Chapel. What's attractive about it is that it was constructed, painted by one of our own faculty members, a young woman, a very well-known artist, Maria Tomasula. And she manages to capture, I think, she herself of Hispanic background, she manages to capture, especially with the roses and so on, some of the more lush kinds of art that public art that one thinks about from Latin America. Everybody with me? Can you hang on for a little bit more? Our Lady of Sorrows. This is a window in the engineering building. The engineering building has a lot of great art in it. Why Our Lady of Sorrows? Our Lady of Sorrows because that's the patronal feast of the Congregation of Holy Cross. Feast day is September the 15th or October the 15th? September the 15th. I'm going to show you another rather dramatically different Our Lady of Sorrows in just a few minutes. I don't know if my wife was able to get the particular of this. There's a tear running down her cheek in this. The devotion to Our Lady of Sorrows began in the Middle Ages. There was a group of Florentine laymen who had a particular devotion to what they called the sorrows of Mary. And of course, it was inevitable that they would come up with 7 sorrows of Mary. That's kind of standard. But the theme was connected to the idea of the prophecy in Luke's gospel that Mary's heart would be pierced by a sword. And so they linked that notion, and they had a particular devotion to Our Lady of Sorrows, and that small group of laymen eventually became a religious order called the Servites, the Servants of Mary. I mean, there's a Servite house in Chicago, Illinois, and been known all over the country. Up until the 16th century, the image of Our Lady of Sorrows and the devotion to Our Lady of Sorrows was pretty much ad hoc. You know, this particular place would observe and other places would observe it, etc. But it became a universal feast in the church only in the 19th century, but it was wide. By the 16th century, it was widespread and celebrated on September the 15th. And let me just show you the next picture. Oh, I'm sorry, this is out of order. This is this is a very interesting. I discovered this kind of messing around when I was running the chapel's book. This is in Siegfried Hall. And according to a description off to the side, it's a 12th century polychromed image of Our Lady of Wisdom holding the Christ child that dates from the 12th century. And it's on, and according to the description on the side, it was on permanent loan or long-term loan from the Snipe Museum. Well, I had a number of questions about it. First of all, is that really 12th century? Maybe. Where did it come from? Haven't got a clue. Called the Snipe, discovered they didn't even have an image of it. They probably in the archive somewhere, they have an accession certificate and so on and so forth. But it is really a striking piece of art. I mean, it's a very interesting piece of art. When you walk into the Siegfried Chapel, it's behind you. It's up against the back wall of the Siegfried Chapel. And it's quite an interesting piece, and it's a variation on that Our Lady of Wisdom theme. Look at this. This is where Cyril and I are going to end up someday. This is in Cedar Grove Cemetery. Cyril and I have adjacent plots so that one of our kids will come visit the graves after we're gone. This is Our Lady of Sorrows. This is done by the sculptor Robert Graham. He did the Moreau statue and the Basilica and so on. Quite a striking piece of work. The formal part of the sculpture, he just goes down to this thing. But what he does for a work that looks so contemporary is that he adds the swords, symbolically swords, that you tend to find in devotional art. You can go to many Italian churches and find Our Lady of Sorrows with 7 swords. Also in Germany, it was very common to find in Germany and so on. So he does a contemporary version, not quite as chaste and as laid back as the Stimson-Rennick window that I showed you a little bit earlier, but dramatic in its own way. This was actually the last work that Robert Graham did for the university before his passing. Of course. The grotto. Built 1896. Basically the gift of a diocesan priest who was a friend of the university and so on, Father Thomas Carroll. It's about 1/7 the size of the actual grotto in Lourdes itself. I don't know how many people in this room have been to Lourdes, but if you've been to Lourdes, the Lourdes grotto tends to be part of a larger massif. And it's kind of lachrymose looking. It's kind of dark looking when you get there. And then, of course, there's all this stuff for the Lourdes baths and so on and so forth below that. What the artist did here, and I think it's a really quite interesting place. I'm particularly impressed by the stonework and so on. A statue of Our Lady of Lourdes and Bernadette down here. Father Sorin would have known, because he frequently went back to France, he would have known of the Lourdes phenomenon. And I think that there's something about Lourdes and France which is worthwhile mentioning, because I still have a minute or two before I'm going to take myself up. France, as you know, the church in France, as you know, was in desperate shape after the French Revolution. It had been suppressed. Priests that did not make the oath of allegiance to the state were persecuted, harassed. Many of them were martyred, and so on. It was also a period when there was this tremendous rise of rationalism. Now, we tend to think of Lourdes as a place for pious visitors to go, etc. But in the 19th century, especially after from the 1840s on, Lourdes was a powerful, dramatic statement of the church against the secular governments of France. The Assumptionist fathers, fathers of the Assumption, would run these trains from Paris down to the Pyrenees, down to the border of France and Spain to visit the shrine of Lourdes. By the thousands, people would come by the thousands. They set up the medical bureau in the 19th century. There were famous debates between non-believing doctors and doctors from Lourdes about the authenticity of cures there, etc. It was the public face of the church. And there was a sense in which it was the triumph of piety over rationalism, in this sense that Bernadette herself, who after the apparitions pretty much disappears from the view. I mean, she goes off to the convent. We never hear from her again during her lifetime. She led a life of obscurity. She had almost no education. And so at the height of French rationalism, it comes along a little kid, peasant kid, didn't speak proper French. If you see what she reports of what Our Lady said to her, it's not in, you're not going to learn that French at the University of Notre Dame. Kind of a dialect. Nobody believed her. Parish priest didn't believe her, thought she was crazy. The bishop didn't believe her. Certainly the mayor didn't believe her. Most of the people didn't believe her, etc. She persisted, and she said, well, this is what I've seen, and it caught on. And then it became a kind of a countersign to the secular world of France. It became extraordinarily popular. I think that of all the places where there have been purported visions of Our Lady in the 19th and 20th century, and that, you can multiply those. You have Knock in Ireland, and you have La Salette in France, and you have Fatima in Portugal, and Medjugorje in this century, and so on and so forth. Lourdes somehow captured the imagination of people, and I think that especially in the 19th century, it was a kind of a statement of the church against the forces that were against the church. I'm going to go back to that one more time. Here's another interesting thing. I mean, they'll be cranking out the candles today, huh? Everybody goes down to the grotto. But here's the interesting thing about the grotto, in my estimation, because I think it really is a kind of a holy place. Almost never, when you drive by the grotto or walk by the grotto, is it ever without at least one person there. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. Wouldn't you love to have $5 for every couple that got engaged at the grotto? And God bless them for thinking of that. But I know even when the weather's been horrible and whatnot, you will see people, a little group that says the rosary there every evening and so on. It has a kind of a special place, and as a guide at the Basilica on football weekends, typically, that's one place everybody wants to go to. And I look at it as a sacred place in its own right, worthy of the veneration of Our Lady, and a good symbol of the kind of direct devotion to Our Lady that energized Father Soren to come here in the first place, and a piety that has kind of given a shape to this university, which I hope that it never loses. That's my story, and I'm sticking with it. Thank you all very much. There are many other things. I mean, I could have done many of the windows and places in the chapels. There was just too much, but I thought this would be an interesting little survey. So we got to stop at 11:30, isn't that right, John? So if anyone would like to ask any questions or vilify the speaker or whatnot, I'd be happy to. Yes, sir,
The
please.
best thing I want to do in the world is vilify you. It's wonderful. Am I not correct that in Salve Regina, the hymn, are the words Vita Dulcedo Spes, which are on the seal of the university?
Yes, that's right. Our life, our sweetness, and our hope. That's the motto of the university, taken from the Salve Regina. Herman the Cripple.
Herman the Cripple.
Herman the Cripple. If that, in fact, is the guy that... Anyone else wish to ask a question, make a comment? I'm sorry. Oh, yes, please.
Golden Dome, that's the same one, the same statue that Father Soren put up? Was from, or was it changed? Was there a different artist?
Well, you know the main building burnt down,
Yeah.
and then they rebuilt it. And I don't know the exact date when that, Danielle, do you know the exact date when that figure was put up? I think Sister Danielle told me that it was the donors from St. Mary's that gave the money for that statue. Did you tell me that? You didn't tell me. Someone told me that. It was up while Father Soren was still alive, but it was from the renewed main building. And they rebuilt it with the Golden Dome. I remember there's a famous story in which he said that when the main building burned down and he came and he said, this was a message from Our Lady, we built too small. We're going to rebuild it, we're going to rebuild it bigger. I'm sorry, Sister Ann?
I was wondering, was it in the 50s when Father Peyton, a Holy Cross priest, kind of led this sort of national, the family that prays together, stays together. It was kind of really promoting the prayer of the rosary. And I was wondering, was there any visual symbol connected with that? Is there anything you can look at on campus today that would remind you of that?
You know, he was, now Father Krause is here, so he might be able to correct me. Father Peyton was not located here at Notre Dame. He was located, I think, on the West Coast, and he had this crusade. I mean, he was the poor man's Fulton Sheen. I mean, this guy was extremely well known all over the country, in fact, all over the world. And he had this, they still have a residue of his organization, which now makes videos and films and whatnot, family, something, I can't remember the exact name of it. And he was an extremely popular speaker, but he didn't have a direct, he was from the Congregation of Holy Cross, but he didn't have a direct Notre Dame connection. Yeah, Father Patrick Peyton. He was from Ireland. He had a touch of the brogue, and he was a great preacher. I mean, I've seen videos of his sermons and so on. I didn't know of him personally. Yes, Father Krause.
I was going to make the point of the family that prays together stays together. My dear father, as the athletic director and with Frank Leahy, I want one of the lines that repeated both in the Moose statue as well as the Mr. Notre Dame book. Dad, on the football weekend, he would point to his players, and I remember this well. You guys behaved, this was after the war, of course. You guys behaved, our mother's watching us from the door. Our mother's watching us from the door.
This is Moose Krause's son.
Our mother's watching us.
What year the hymns ended at the University of Notre Dame. My dad graduated in '29. I met a few of them who he knew when he was a student.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part.
What year did the minimums?
Oh gosh, I think they were gone well before the Depression started.
Okay.
The minims,
Yeah.
the little kids that were spending. I think they were, yeah.
So sometime in the 20s.
I don't know the answer to that question.
No, it's interesting, the timing is interesting. The school was founded in 1842, but the Immaculate Conception wasn't until 1854.
54.
So that then it was after that the second school came to be. In other words, the new vision probably was inspired by the declaration of the dogma.
Yeah. Well, I kind of have this feeling that the key to understanding not only the piety of Father Soren, I've read Marvin O'Connell's great biography, but I mean, you got to be, persistent because it's a 600-page biography. It's a very thorough biography. I think that to understand Father Soren in particular and the Holy Cross charism more generally, you really have to understand a kind of a piety that grew up in France after the 16th century, 17th century piety. Now, I haven't got time to talk about this in any length, but basically what happened was this. St. Teresa of Avila, whose centenary we're celebrating this year, 500 years, she sent nuns to France before she died. And they had a big impact on some thinkers in France, spiritual people in France. And these people reacted against the kind of Christian humanism that had been around the 16th century. They strongly identified with the transcendence of God, with the incarnation, with Our Lady, and they were especially interested in the education of priests. So you have all these congregations being formed in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. And one of the key elements was this devotion to Our Lady, probably in reaction against, at least partially, the Protestant Reformation. So you have this big flourishing of Marian devotion in the 16th century. So you get entire religious communities that were founded in France with a particular emphasis on Our Lady. Like St. John Eudes would be a very good example of the Immaculate Hearts of the Picpus Fathers, who, I guess the most famous is St. Blessed Damien, the priest of the lepers, and so on. The Marists, the Marianists, and so on. Just talking about male orders, female orders even more than them. And this, I don't want to give you a big boring academic lecture here, but this Marian devotion, I think, is intimately connected with their high understanding of Christ. I'm thinking of people like De Rule and so on, the people that come after. So Soren didn't live in a vacuum. He came out of a particular kind of culture. Anyway, that's what I think. Yes,
I think we have
please.
time for one more question.
And here's the man.
Oh, I was just, would like if that visitation statue were not surrounded by grass. Because it seems like an eminently touchable piece, which you're not supposed to do, and would also permit a person to really kind of walk.
Yeah, that grass is a little bit high to do. I mean, you could walk around it if you wanted to, but I wouldn't suggest
You
it.
can't get close to it.
Actually, I think that for public outdoor sculpture, you not only should be permitted to touch it, you should be encouraged to touch it. I mean, if you look at the great statues, for example, in Millennium Park in Chicago, they want you to touch those things. Or the big public sculptures that you find outside of public buildings, you know, should touch them, should touch that Picasso in downtown Chicago and sit your kids on the plinth beneath it and take pictures of them. That's what public sculptures are for. I mean, after all, my God, they're made out of marble or bronze. They're not gonna disappear. Yes, ma'am. Okay, this is absolutely the last question. Yes. And I'm gonna be very brief.
I don't have a question, but I thought in conclusion, maybe we could pray the Hail, Holy Queen. It's a beautiful prayer for this great.
How many know it?
city.
Okay, let's stand if we're gonna do that. I was gonna suggest the Hail Mary, but good idea. Okay, lead us in the prayer.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail,
Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy, our life, our sweetness, and our hope. To thee we cry, poor banished children of Eve. To thee we send up our sighs, mourning, weeping, and silent tears. Turn then, most gracious Advocate, thine eyes of mercy towards us. And after this our exile, show unto us the blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus. O clement, O loving, O sweet Virgin Mary, pray for us, O Holy Mother of God, that we may be made worthy of the promises of Christ.
Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. I know it in Latin better than I know.